Thank you, everyone, all of our brave master students who are here today. Maybe the bachelors will join, maybe they won't. Um, I'm going to talk about some mostly empirical rather than embodied, but maybe we'll get some embodiment, aesthetics perspectives. And yeah, it's somewhat different than what I would normally focus on, but because you are in the architecture department, trying to keep the studies and the observations here relevant to what a cognitive neuroscientist thinks could be relevant to architects. So of course this could be a discussion as well, but yeah, that's what we're going to go for today. I'll just start with a very brief, not really introduction, but just overview of what we do in the social brain sciences group at ETH. So this is the research group, Social Brain Sciences, and kind of what our aim is and what we kind of are really interested in how we perceive other people, but also how we perceive other social agents that we see in this world. So talking a lot about artificial agents, robots, avatars. We focus a lot of our work on social interaction, as well as how we might optimize social interactions with embodied artificial agents like robots. We also do a lot on the role of the body in aesthetic processing. So whether that's in visual aesthetics, performing arts aesthetics, that's a big interest. And then the use of artificial agents as learning tools is a space we're also quite active in. So it's a really quite broad remit of research that we cover in the professorship. And I'll be talking about precisely none of that today, really. I will be talking about empirical aesthetics, but not so much what we've done in our team, but kind of what's been done in the field by many colleagues that are outstanding that could be relevant to what you're learning about in this super fascinating course. Yes, this is kind of one snapshot of some of our team members, and you can see some of the methods we use. We focus a lot with brain imaging, with virtual reality, with different types of brain imaging. You'll be hearing about some of those types today, such as fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging. We also do more mobile neuroimaging, which we're not going to be talking about as much today. We do motion capture, we do stuff with children, we do stuff with visual arts, et cetera, and lots of stuff with robots, which didn't seem to make it onto that picture. But that just kind of shows you a very brief snapshot of the areas that we work in and some of the tools that we work with, and that might or might not be relevant to some of the discussions we have at the back end of this lecture. And as I mentioned, we had a fantastic lecture in the neuroaesthetics class led by Dr. Yanela Barra by this senior lecturer from Liverpool Hope University, Letizia Palumbo. And I sat through her lecture a few weeks ago and I was so impressed by it. And I said to her, Letizia, would you mind sharing your slides with me? Because I think what you've just spoken about here is going to be very relevant to the Architectonics of Mind, from the Mind class that we have here at ETH. So I'm going to be giving a guest lecture on. So a lot of the material for these slides has come from inspiration from Letizia, who is also a cognitive scientist based at Liverpool Hope University. She works in the visual cognition area, kind of at slightly more lower level basic processing of visual stimuli, but with a real interest as well in kind of the social sides of visual stimulus perception and aesthetics, and lots of interest in architecture as well. So yeah, we'll be hearing about some of the some of her very own work, but also we'll have some slides from her. So there's going to be kind of two big areas I'm hoping to cover in today's lecture, and we should be fine. We're not going to go probably even to 40 minutes. We'll probably be closer to a half hour. What I'm hoping to talk about in the first part is what we know from the empirical aesthetics and especially the neuroaesthetics world in terms of how aesthetic evaluations of object design are calculated and computed. And the second part will focus a bit more on the impact of architectural design on liking and people's approach and avoidance decisions. And yeah, hopefully this will give us some rich material for discussion. So when we think about aesthetic evaluations of object design, this will probably be something that many of you maybe have come into contact with more. There's many aspects we can think of, and when designers, when artists are often thinking about in object design how to kind of create something that's really striking and really visually of aesthetic interest, there's often discussions about kind of this balance between form and function. And the perfect balance between aesthetics and functionality brings us this idea of beauty and usability. So especially product design, but I'm guessing in built spaces and built environments as well, this is the case as well. So there's this notion that's been around in the aesthetics domain for quite some time now, that pleasure derives from the balance between aesthetic properties and functionality. So if we go back to this lovely tilting teapot, if it was just aesthetically interesting but functionally a complete flop, this wouldn't, this wouldn't give us this beauty and usability idea. It would just be like, okay, that's an interesting artifact, but there's no utility to this artifact. But the fact that, and you can buy this teapot if you look up Tilting Teapot by Ronefelt. You can Google it, you can buy it. It's like, I don't know, 50 francs, $50, something like that. And it actually has a lot of thought put into how the tea leaves steep and how you get more kind of exposure to the tea leaves in hot water than you would in a typical teapot. So it's not just aesthetically interesting potentially, but it also is highly functional, and that should kind of maximize this beauty and usability maxim that we see here. So that's something that kind of guides a lot of thinking in the design space, but we can kind of go back many decades to 2 centuries ago, and we can begin to draw on some kind of more primitives or basic ideas about aesthetics, and this idea of experimental aesthetics. And aesthetics have fascinated thinkers for many millennia now. In fact, we know that the ancient Romans and Greeks had great interest in aesthetic properties and aesthetic beauty. But we can trace this back even farther in history to like kind of some of the earliest known artifacts produced by man. There were ideas of aesthetics and uh, ideal depictions of the human form and of the natural world as well. But back in the early 1800s, Gustav Fechner, who was a kind of early experimental, well, they didn't call him psychologists then. I think there was, but he kind of gave rise to a lot of the ideas that we use, that we've used at the start of the birth of modern psychology and throughout. He kind of established this idea of experimental aesthetics, based on laws that are established laws from psychophysics to examine shapes and dimensions of aesthetically pleasing objects. So can we kind of use the mathematical formulae or physical properties, physical things that we can measure to determine what is something that is beautiful, what is something that is aesthetically pleasing? And his work, he spoke about this. He didn't come up with this, but the idea that the golden section is the ratio of a geometrical shape, width to length ratio that is most appealing to the eye. And of course, we've seen this from antiquity, arts examples in antiquity, well through to modern age, that the golden section or the golden ratio is often used to great effect. And he wrote about, and future scholars who's looked into his work have mentioned this as well, this idea of good gestalt. And the violation of the law of good gestalt can hurt our senses of beauty. So if visual elements or physical elements kind of are jarring against each other and don't fit, they don't have to fit the golden ratio or the golden section, but they have to be balanced in a certain way in order to draw our eye in and to kind of give us this feeling of something that fits well together. And when there's kind of clear violations of laws of good gestalt, this can hurt our sense of beauty. And this was again in the early 1900s. There was very great interest in kind of understanding more and kind of operationalizing at an even finer detail, kind of what works aesthetically to the human eye. And the Gestalt principles that we're talking about here, when we talk about the violation of them hurts our eyes, well, what are these Gestalt principles? So there's a few of them. And this, again, Gestalt psychology is kind of one of the founding branches of psychology from the past 200 years. And Gestalt principles focus on grouping. So this idea that kind of putting things together based on proximity, based on similarity, bringing them closer to proximity that's a good Gestalt principle. So if we kind of look at this example here, these three cubes together, that wouldn't be as kind of aesthetically pleasing or following Gestalt principles as much as these three here that are put together in the same way. And you can kind of see the same this example in the image on the right side as well. So all the gray boxes are together, the blue boxes are together, the gray boxes are together. That gives us that satisfies our perception of the Gestalt principle of grouping, because we have proximity and similarity kind of working harmoniously there. Also, a Gestalt principle is of symmetry. So if we have things of kind of look that appear equivalent on both sides of the visual field, or both sides of the space, or both sides of an object, this is more aesthetically pleasing than a lack of symmetry in general. Well, more on that in just a moment. So if we have these two brackets which match, that's more aesthetically pleasing because of symmetry compared to the ones that don't. There's Gestalt principles related to figure ground segmentation, so looking at the positive space, such as this black, what looks like a vase or a candle holder here, or the negative space. So you can see the two white faces on either side of the black positive space. This is another Gestalt principle that designers and artists often work with to great effect. The law of pragnance, or good continuation here. You can, if you just see these blue images without the kind of the intersecting, the overlapping parts of the circles that are blanked out, what we normally do is kind of fill those in with our eyes. And again, lots of logos, the law of pragnance is used to great effect. Same thing in the law of closure. If you see these kind of three lines, three line segments like you can see here, most people will see a T and they'll kind of close off these the missing lines. And this is because the law of closure, the human visual system, like the Gestalt principles kind of capture and describe what the human visual system kind of has been biologically hardwired to do, to kind of make sense of our visual world with shortcuts. And we know with the identification of these principles that they allow us to kind of pick out what's kind of meaningfully beautiful and simple and easy to kind of apprehend in our visual world. And again, the Gestalt principles have been around for a very long time, but kind of the birth of modern cognitive neuroscience, the end of the 1990s, spent a lot of time kind of trying to understand how the Gestalt principles are manifest in the human visual system. And that started out with some of the early work by Ramachandran and Samir Zeki. And for just a point of trivia here, Samir Zeki, who was a visual neuroscientist from UCL, who is a visual neuroscientist from UCL in the UK, he is also kind of credited with being the founder of neuroaesthetics as a discipline. So not just understanding kind of perceptual and behavioral consequences of aesthetic experiences, but what's the underlying neurocognitive machinery that gives rise to aesthetic experiences. So kind of coming back to what we're finding out from cognitive neuroscience investigations, we're finding out some very interesting things. And here's one study by Letizia Palumbo and colleagues from a few years ago. And what they were looking at here is, what's going on when they put EEG caps. So that's what you can see in the picture on the left there. So EEG stands for electroencephalography. It's this cap with many, many channels that kind of covers the entire scalp. And these channels are able to read out kind of localized recordings or localized traces of electrical activity. And we know from an EEG is one of the oldest brain imaging technologies we have. So we've known for well over 100 years now that, that different parts of the brain give rise to different electrical potentials depending on what you're seeing or what you're thinking about. It's a really widely available, relatively economically inexpensive brain imaging technique, but it's also really quite fiddly too, because if you move your head at all, the signals just go haywire. You can't get much out of them. And kind of another really important thing to keep in mind when we talk about this type of brain imaging compared to some of the other types that I'll present later in the lecture, with EEG, we're really just constrained to what's going on at the cortical surface of the brain. So we can't say as much about what's going on deep within the brain, within kind of more midbrain regions, brain regions that are associated with kind of more primitive types of reward processing, because we're limited to the cortex, just the outer layer of the brain. But with that being said, what Letizia and her colleagues were interested in this study was looking at something which they called the sustained posterior negativity. You can see it written in red there. And it's known that this sustained posterior negativity, this is an EEG signal. It's a waveform that kind of appears in the EEG signal, and it's known that this is relatively more negative. It's kind of a bigger signal for symmetrical compared to random patterns. So what they showed people in this study were kind of these what looked like random dot patterns, but with different levels of symmetry. So they could have perfect symmetry, which you can see in kind of the far left image here. They could have 80% symmetry, 60, 40, 20, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're seeing underneath here are kind of the traces, the grand averages of these EEG traces. And you can see that when there's perfect symmetry in these images, and kind of this averaged across many participants and many different trials, so it's not just one-off sort of thing, there's kind of a much greater negativity here. Um, I should also say, as well as this 20% kind of symmetry, there was also a completely random one, so like 0% symmetry. And yes, what we can see in these wave traces here is that we kind of get a greater sustained posterior negativity, and that's what you're seeing in this kind of ruby red line here, in this plot here, and the grand average, and here you're seeing it as well. In a grand average different wave, so kind of across these two electrodes here, which are right at the back of the brain over visual regions. And essentially what they're saying is that the more symmetrical there is, kind of the more robust signal you're getting and these kind of these really posterior brain regions. So what they're concluding, or what they're able to show in this, is that this sustained posterior negativity seems to be generated at an intermediate level of visual processing. And kind of based on other brain imaging studies, they think it's located in the lateral occipital complex. That's a brain region. For the non-neuroscientists among us, which is probably most people, it doesn't really matter. But the lateral occipital complex is, you can see this PO and P8 here. Those are kind of like regions kind of near the lateral occipital complex. Their lateral occipital complex is kind of a higher level visual processing region in the brain. So it's not super early visual cortex, which is right at the very, very back of the brain. So it'd be like right down here, but it's a little bit more anterior. And this is an area where they think perceptual goodness is represented. So now we're coming back to these Gestalt principles. So they think that this analysis of perceptual goodness, so kind of the more perceptually good, the more symmetrical something is, kind of the more robust the signal is. They think that this comes after initial visual analysis, but before people are making any decisions about a stimulus. And this kind of this is a threshold that's applied to the analog lateral occipital complex response. And I think something that's really interesting about this study, because people often ask, why do we need brain imaging, like to understand how people perceive things, or to understand, like, what symmetry is doing to our perceptual system. What's really cool about this study is these findings, like people weren't always able to tell that this is, this has 80% symmetry or 60% or 40% or 20%. Yes, people could tell that there's more symmetry in this far left image than in this far right image, but oftentimes people couldn't explicitly identify how much symmetry there is. And yet at the group level, the brain signals are kind of pulling apart, or they're separating in such a way that in a very clear way with kind of more and more and more symmetry, this sustained posterior negativity is becoming more and more extreme. So a really kind of valuable thing or application of brain imaging is that when people have like no conscious awareness or insight into what they're actually seeing, the brain is still kind of able to code and respond to, in this case, symmetry in a really sensitive and precise way, which is kind of cool. So there's been more studies about people's preferences and perceptions of symmetry. And this is one study that kind of followed this up in a different way. And this is a really, really creative study. And I think I have some critiques of it as well, but I think it tells us, it gives us some new insights. So in this study, there was no brain scanning involved in this one. Instead, people were just kind of given images to look at. This is more of a psychophysics study, and people saw kind of 4 different categories of objects, kind of in these very well-controlled psychophysical visual experiments. So they saw faces, and you can see, we do this a lot in psychology, the actual identities of the faces are covered by a white oval, so you're not really focused on identities, you're just kind of looking at the kind of peripheral facial stroke head features. People also saw random patterns, they saw flowers, and they saw natural landscapes. And I think they've made an error in this image here, which you will hopefully see in a second. But essentially, they could show people all of these images kind of as they naturally appear. Oh no, they've not made an error. No, they've made an error right here with this one here. Yes, so they could show the faces, these abstract patterns, the flowers and the natural landscapes kind of as they naturally occur, which is with asymmetries in them, because No one's face is perfectly symmetrical. No flower is perfectly symmetrical. No landscape is perfectly symmetrical. And of course, they were in control of how they designed these abstract images. And I think the mistake they made is that this one right here should be up and this row right here, but never mind. But they also manipulated each of these stimuli such that they were perfectly symmetrical. So they showed, that same face, the same faces, the same objects, the same flowers, and the same landscapes, but with perfect left-right symmetry. So, people weren't necessarily consciously aware of this, but this is what they showed people. And they just asked people to rank these images kind of across a number of different measures. And what they see here is that people prefer symmetric faces and symmetrical abstract images, which is what you can see right here. So especially for female faces, there was a very big pronounced preference for the modified symmetrical ones, which, advertisers have certainly taken note of when they either pick out models that have more symmetrical features or kind of adjust faces to look more symmetrical. With males, it wasn't as pronounced. But yes, there was for these abstract pictures that you can see in the gray here, there was also a preferred, the beauty ratings were higher if they were symmetrical compared to original and asymmetrical. And this was even more pronounced if they had smooth contours compared to more angular contours. But interestingly, when it comes to the natural world, we're seeing, well, the non-human side of the natural world, we're seeing slightly different findings in that for flowers, there was really no pronounced difference in preferences, whether it was the original flowers, like you see an example of here, or the ones that were photoshopped to be perfectly left-right symmetrical. People didn't really express a preference. And of course, to me, when I look at these stimuli, I think completely unsurprisingly, people preferred the asymmetrical natural landscapes to the symmetrical ones, because the symmetrical ones, to me at least, look like highly photoshopped and highly unrealistic. And I don't really think they got into asking people how aware they were of these stimuli being manipulated to be perfectly symmetrical, but I think it's just super obvious here. And people, whether they had conscious awareness or access to it or not, they certainly preferred a lack of symmetry in natural landscapes. So kind of interesting behavioral data that kind of supports this idea that symmetry is good in most situations, but not all. Um, but there's been lots written about symmetry. And then this very interesting study came out in the Empirical Studies of the Arts about 5 years ago. And I really like this study in many ways, because I think it asks a very simple question and it addresses it in a pretty clever way. So the title gives it away. The title is "Symmetry is Not a Universal Law of Beauty." And there's some kind of big names in empirical aesthetics on this, including Helmut Leder. And they kind of motivate this study by saying, scientific disciplines, including biology, physics, and psychological aesthetics, which is what we just saw in these previous studies, regularly regard symmetry as one of the most important principles in nature and one of the most powerful detriments of beauty. Powerful determinants of beauty. But then on the flip side, and this is really interesting, and this is, why multidisciplinary work and especially bringing in the perspectives of arts and humanities when we're trying to, study empirical aesthetics is really important. They said, however, symmetry has a low standing in the arts and humanities. So symmetry, in the physical world, pure physics, pure maths, symmetry is the end all be all, but in the arts and humanities, it's not given this kind of exalted status. And they say this difference in the variation of symmetry is a remarkable illustration of the gap between the two cultures, of the arts and the sciences. So here they wanted to try to close this gap, and they looked at an interdisciplinary empirical study that tried to quantify the impacts of art expertise. I think they look at, yeah, okay, so they're art experts for artists and art historians. So not designers, but artists and art historians. They also had a group of non-experts, so people with no special art training or art expertise. And they had them kind of provide spontaneous beauty ratings on visual stimuli, like the ones you see here. So these kind of look like the ones that you saw in the Palumbo article as well, kind of just random patterns of dots, black dots on a white surface. And it's a really cool way of visualizing the data as well, because you can see here if they have 160 pictures that each group is ranking, so the art experts and the art non-experts, and your stimuli types, you can see here in this color code. So symmetrical complex are the dark red, which you can see kind of right here. Examples of symmetrical simple are, can we see some examples here? I think, yeah, are looking like this here. And then we have asymmetrical complex, which are these ones here. And then we can have asymmetrical simple, which are these ones here, are examples of them there. So essentially what you can see, if people are kind of forced to rank these kind of just random patterns, not random patterns, but these patterns from 1 to 160, you can see that the non-experts really, really like these kind of symmetrical, whether it's simple or complex, but mostly symmetrical complex the most. And what they like the least are these asymmetrical simple figures, and everything else kind of falls in the middle. But artists show a very different pattern. So they really like the asymmetrical asymmetrical complex ones the most, and they're assigning the lowest ratings to the symmetrical and simple ones. And art historians show a somewhat similar pattern, but much more similar to the artists and the non-experts. So what they're suggesting here is that art experts find asymmetrical and simple stimuli as the most beautiful, whereas that is not, it was a complete opposite category that the non-experts preferred. And they suggest that this means that there's effects of specific education about art and training on aesthetic appreciation. So there's no aesthetic primitives. Aesthetics, your kind of aesthetic preferences are very much shaped by not just kind of your training in a field, but your knowledge about how these elements are worked with and how they're developed. And yeah, so they take this as evidence of a direct challenge to the ideas of symmetry. And I think it's a really nice starting point. What I would have loved to have seen, though, as a follow-up to this, is not just these kind of random patterns, but can we pick examples from art history, from the world of paintings and sculpture, perhaps, of actual pieces that kind of fall into these four categories, and see if that's the same as well. Because I think we have a lot of experimental control with these black and white figures, these kind of patterns, but it's not quite what we're seeing and dealing with in the real world. So it'd be nice to see that replicated. But anyways, that was kind of interesting. So kind of moving on from this idea of symmetry, we can also talk a little bit about fluency, which is written about at length in the empirical aesthetics world. And fluency refers to the ease with which sensory information is processed by the brain, or with which mental tasks or cognitive processes, such as thinking, reasoning, or problem solving, are carried out. And processing fluency is a good thing. People like processing fluency. Processing fluency leads to much more satisfying aesthetic experiences. So things that are processed fluently, effectively positive. We like them. And the ease with which we can process something aesthetically, this is often transferred to kind of positive feelings towards this aesthetic object. And these are kind of two nice examples. Like if you can think that like the prototypical Dutch house is something that we can process quite, easily and fluently, and then you can see the prototypical Dutch house on steroids here or something like it. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to go through and find the individual backstories for all the pictures, but yeah, the idea is that the processing fluency for like this house right here would be very different and much easier and simpler than the processing fluency for this contraption at the top here. So what else do we know about processing fluency? Well, Zients in the late 60s did a lot of work in writing and theorizing in this space. And he talks about this mere exposure effect. And this is a really simple idea. For objects that you kind of like, um, for most of the time or a lot of the time, kind of the more repetitions you have of them, whether that's a pop song, whether that's a new food, whether that's a style of clothing, whether it's an architectural feature, etc. There's this sweet spot that tends to occur around 15 repetitions or so, and that's kind of the asymptote at which people kind of reach their maximal positive affect through repetition. But there's kind of other conditions as well. There's something that you can think about a pop song that's has instant that it kind of really quickly gets stuck in your head and is really interesting and you like it, but then like, oh my gosh, the fifth time you've heard it, you're like, I'm so sick of it and I hate it, and the more I hear it, I hate it even more. So there certainly are situations where this mere exposure effect peaks sooner and then plummets for different types of stimuli. And the important thing is that if you're kind of the first time you hear something, taste something, see something, whatever, and you don't like it, and you clearly do not like it, more exposure makes you like it even less. So it's not as drastic or dramatic as the kind of uptick in liking feelings with mere exposure for stuff you do like or has a potential for you to like. But if it's something that's like, I hate it the first time and I continue to hate it, yeah, the mere exposure effect isn't going to help. And this is always a very interesting line for advertisers, designers, people working in music and public messaging. They have to think about, because you want to hit that sweet spot and not kind of overdo it so that people hate it, but also, you know, give people enough exposure and repetition so that you can kind of amplify or reach that asymptote of the mere exposure effect. So um, yeah, so we can kind of bring some of these ideas together about typicality and about exposure and about familiarity. And there's a very famous researcher who's worked in empirical aesthetics, Berlin, who kind of talks about the main dimensions of aesthetic features. And he proposed in the 70s that like hedonic value, and this kind of is reflected a little bit on what we saw with the study with art experts, art historians, and lay people, but again, it differs based on experience, is that, you know, people can like stuff that is simple and familiar, but there's this moderate level of complexity and novelty that's really the sweet spot for a lot of people in terms of hedonic value, and that's kind of at an intermediate level of arousal potential, whereas something that can be really like quite like makes you wake up and take notice, it's really quite arousing, is stuff that's really complex and novel, but the hedonic value is often less, and that's because the processing fluency, it isn't as easy if something is complex and it's novel. You don't have familiarity to rely upon, and you don't have ease of processing to kind of up hedonic value in that way. So hedonic value can be quite low until something is seemingly less complex and less novel, which happens with repeated exposure. So another researcher to work in this space really was interested in and emphasized the role of prototypicality. So when we think of a lamp, you might think of, you know, this example on the right here, but of course all these are on the left are examples of lamps as well. And this idea, you know, writing in the design space, Martindale said that the more prototypical or the more familiar an object is, the easier it is to process. So fortunately, those working in the design space don't follow all of these rules to a T. But yeah, the ease of processing can enhance aesthetic experience. And there's been some interesting work done in this space. This was from the design department at Delft University, but published in really quite a good psychology journal. And title is Most Advanced Yet Acceptable, that both typicality and novelty are joint predictors of aesthetic preference in industrial design. So here they looked at the design of sanders, so like hand sanders, which you can see in the top row there, telephones, next row, tea kettles and cars. And essentially across 3 different studies here with different sets of participants, they found that typicality, so something, you know, they just operationalized as goodness of examples. This is a really good example of a telephone or a really good example of a tea kettle, and novelty are jointly and equally effective in explaining aesthetic preferences to consumer products, but they suppress each other's effects. So this was a really interesting finding, because it wasn't like if something's really novel, then it's, you know, not as typical, and if it's really typical, then it's not really novel. So both of these things can be really important. So what they concluded from this study is that designers should be aiming to achieve this optimal combination of both typicality and novelty. So in some way, try to tie in or think about how to weave in aspects of both, which is quite interesting. So kind of further studies in this space kind of echo that same findings. This is one was looking at chair design from another TU Eindhoven study. And again, you can see there's this kind of sweet spot for aesthetic preferences. So the higher the dots are, the more beautiful across all these plots. And along the x-axis, we have kind of, well, for each plot shows novelty, complexity, emotion, and trendiness. And here, something we have from typicality to uniqueness, kind of right in the middle are the most beautiful chairs. Complexity, again, right in the middle. It's not quite as clean of a relationship. We have that there. And for emotionality, and how you rate emotionality in design is something that designers are very clear to articulate, but might not be something that's obvious to everyone, but kind of something in between rational, emotional. And this showed a little bit more of a linear relationship for things being seen as more beautiful that were more modern compared to traditional. But yeah, this was published in 2012. We always have to think about when studies were published, who the participants were, to understand kind of how universal the findings are. But interesting. And kind of another plot from this same study here, you can see the individual chair exemplars that kind of, in this typical unique and ugly and beautiful kind of rating space where the chairs are. And you know, you can have a look at that and see if you agree with it. There are some totally wacky ones out here in the unique space, and are the ones in the ugly and typical space terrible? It's up for debate, but this is where kind of the individual chair exemplars they had got rated as a group by their participants. I just realized that, of course, I am jabbering on way too much, and I'm going to make sure we have time. So I'll try to talk for about 4 or 5 more minutes, and then I'll make sure I cut us off at 40 minutes past so we can have discussions. This is just one more study that tried to look at this relationship between prototypicality. So kind of the P and the N stands for prototypical and non-prototypical, and these kind of complex labels. And then they looked at chairs and speakers, simple and complex. And they kind of wanted to understand, in this study, they used fMRI, so a different type of brain imaging, which allows us to get deeper into the brain to kind of dig into what's going on here. And essentially, what they find here in the brain is a functional gradient between the preference processing of simplicity and prototypicality. So essentially, they see that different visual brain regions are kind of kicking in and helping kind of pull apart the features of both objects that are typical, so the chairs and the speakers that are both typical compared to non-prototypical, as well as complex and simple. So yeah, I won't get into the great detail here, but the fact that they're able to pull apart these brain responses for both typicality and complexity suggests that, you know, preferences are actually shaped by this really complex landscape, and it's not like we can pin it down to one feature in particular. There's a complex interaction. One more study, which that used fMRI, so this kind of brain scanning technique that allows us to look deep within the brain. This is a really interesting one, and I actually went to grad school with the second author on this study, and have seen this study presented in several aesthetics contexts in the past. So these are actually, these two researchers are emotion researchers. They're not really interested in aesthetics per se. They're interested in the visual system and how it kind of relates to emotion. But here they wanted to understand and to explore whether, you know, basic visual cues that determine our preferences towards everyday objects, you know, the extent to which these basic visual cues are connected like inherently to emotion. So they've based this on prior work, which shows that people tend to like objects with curved contours compared to those with pointy features, and that this bias, there's this idea that this bias stems from an implicit perception of threat or harm that might come from really sharp, angular, or spiky features. So they tried to test this hypothesis by looking at the engagement of the amygdala. So the amygdala, you can see it in this cross section of the brain image right here. So it's this kind of midbrain structure, part of the limbic system. It's involved in kind of emotion processing. They wanted to know if the amygdala, so it's a brain structure that's also involved in fear processing and kind of like arousal and valence in general, um, was going to be more robustly involved when people are looking at kind of spiky angular objects compared to curved objects. And indeed, that's exactly what they found. So whether it's a watch, whether it's a can, whether it's a pan, whether it's abstract forms, all manner of things, they see that the amygdala is more robustly engaged when something has sharp angles to it compared to rounder angles, whether that was for real objects or novel patterns. And they also saw that there was kind of the typical finding behaviorally, and that people behaviorally had more like responses for objects that had curved contours, as well as novel patterns with curved contours compared to sharp contours. So again, they're trying to like build this case that evolutionarily we kind of don't like things that have super spiky contours because they implicitly are telling us that something could be potentially threatening or dangerous. So a really interesting idea. This is just this one plot here, which is super interesting. Uh, in terms of, spiky or more angular designs versus more curved designs. This is a really cool study. I won't get into the details of what they did methodologically, but you can see very clearly there's kind of two panels to this plot. One is liking ratings and one is how curved these objects are. And what these objects are in this study are cars. So they're looking at car designs from 1950 to 1955. They take this across Audi, BMW, Ford, Mercedes, Opel, and Volkswagen. And turns out there is a very low point for automobile design in, kind of the 70s to, well, mid 60s to mid 80s, where the curvature kind of went away. Cars were really boxy and square. And when they show people pictures of cars from these different eras later, yes, they very much like the ones that became much more curved or that started off in a much more curved state. And that you can see that liking dips when curvature dips. So that's, I think, a really interesting little snapshot of a study. So key points so far, and maybe we'll end here and go to questions, even though I know my next slides were about architecture per se, but maybe kind of thinking about these more kind of basic primitives isn't a bad place to stop anyways. What we can see are that visual properties that are easy to process, these often drive preferences on a kind of generalistic population level. Once you get experts involved, things do get a bit more complex. We see that familiarity, prototypicality, and mere exposure are really strong determinants of aesthetic evaluations, and that the relationship between these attributes, such as novelty and typicality, can be relatively independent and sometimes hard to square together. And preference for object properties does change across time. We can see that from that car example. And that empirical aesthetics can very much inform evidence-based practice for object design. And again, I'm sorry that the next slides talk about architecture, but it's fine. I'll share the slides with you and you can look through them. And one of the papers that was shared kind of on interior environments kind of gets into this in really good detail. And I'm happy to answer questions about those too. But I will stop talking now and happy to take questions.